ورسوله قال الله تعالى في القرآن المجيد بعد أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم أحسب الناس أن يتركوا أن يقولوا آمنا وهم لا يفتنون. Alhamdulillah, we begin by praising Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We seek His forgiveness, we seek His assistance. Whomsoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to misguide, there is no guidance for them, and whomsoever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to guide, no one can misguide them. We make dua that Allah guide us, that Allah keep us in the straight path, and we make dua that Allah allow us to pass away as Muslims and be resurrected as Muslims alongside Rasulullah, alongside His companions, alongside all of our pious predecessors. Amen. Dear brothers and sisters, from the greatest blessings that Allah has given us is the blessing of our iman, our faith. The conviction and the faith in our deen, the way of life for us. And when Allah gives and blesses a person with this hidayah, with this guidance, with this deen in their life, it doesn't just come for free. Many of us were born Muslim. We have parents who are Muslim, and some of us here embraced Islam or accepted Islam and converted sometime in their life. Or many of us, even though we were born into Muslim families, may have been very distant from the deen, and then at some point in our lives, as we begin to mature, we realize all the benefits, all the beauties of the deen, what Allah has given us, the way of Rasulullah, and we begin to practice it even more. But Allah reminds us that when a person embraces this faith, this conviction, this iman, whether they convert to Islam or whether they begin to practice the deen all over again, Allah reminds us that that once we begin to practice, embrace, and believe that this is not going, we are not going to go untested. In other words, Allah is going to test our sincerity in our faith. Because sometimes there is a lot of worldly benefit, a lot of worldly gain in being a Muslim. Sometimes we practice on the deen when it only benefits us worldly. Or we do something part of our deen because it has a direct beneficial impact in our lives. In other words, we do something, we follow one of the teachings of the deen, or we associate, or we hang out with certain people because there's some sort of benefit to us in this world. So Allah reminds us that this deen is not just a deen of convenience. It's not a faith of convenience, that you just be Muslim or believe when it's convenient for you, when there's benefit for you, when there's something for you to gain. And then when it's a little bit difficult, when it's inconvenient, or when being a Muslim actually outwardly and apparently causes you to lose something or gain a disadvantage or have some sort of disadvantage, at that point you merely say, oh, let's just leave this aside. Allah reminds us that He's going to test us to see whether or not our faith, our iman in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sincere, and if we really embrace Rasulullah, if we really embrace the Quran, if we really embrace the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purely and sincerely because we believe in Rasulullah, because we believe in Allah, we believe in the Quran, and because we have love for Him, and not because of some sort of monetary or worldly advantage or gain. So Allah is going to test us. And Allah is going to test us with our faith, with our deen. And that is one of the hardest things that a person can go through. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it that He never tests us when it comes to our deen. A person can go through many different tests and tribulations and trials when it comes to their health, when it comes to their families, when it comes to their jobs, their businesses, money, and that's all fine. But when a person is tested and tried for their deen, that's very dangerous. Because if you lose your deen, you've lost pretty much everything in this world and in the hereafter. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us. And if we are ever tested and tried with our deen, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to pass with, as they say, flying colors. Not rainbow colors, but just flying colors. In the time that we live in today, being a Muslim, having that faith, that conviction of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is being tested. The grounds of being a Muslim is being shaken. What we believe in, what we support, it's being tried. It's being pushed back on. It's a social stigma to be a Muslim. It's a social stigma to support basic human rights. It's a stigma to go against a genocide. It's a stigma to go against what is being pushed on us. And many of us, we may feel that our iman, our faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the Quran, as Muslims, we are now being tested. And dear brothers and sisters, whenever you feel like that, the best solution to fortify and strengthen your iman, to protect and preserve your iman during times of difficulty and challenge, is by protecting and preserving your relationship with the Quran. Because the Quran is the ultimate source of guidance. The Quran is the nourishment of our souls. You know how you take care of your body, you feed it, or like how you have a car, you have to put gas in it, and then it starts functioning. Likewise, with our hearts, with our spiritual state, we need to feed it, we need to nourish it. And our relationship with the Quran is a form of nourishment for our iman, for our spiritual selves. So when we take the time to protect and preserve our relationship with the Quran, what we're doing is we are actually protecting and preserving our very iman, our very relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself. In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, "Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikr wa inna lahu lahafidhun." That Allah is the one who revealed the Quran, and Allah is taking full responsibility that Allah will preserve the Quran. When we begin to explore the Quran, and part of having that relationship with the Quran is understanding that the Quran is munazzal min Allah. It's directly from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's revealed from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That the Quran was not something that was authored, was not written down or put together by a bunch of humans or by one person. Rather, the Quran is direct speech, revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam through the intermediary of Jibreel alayhi salam. The Quran is unique. It's not like what the Bible is. It's not like what the Old Testament is. It's not like what the Hindu Vedas or whatever they are. The Quran is unique. The Quran is special. The Quran has been preserved. The Quran has been protected. And until we don't internalize that and appreciate that, it's going to become very difficult for us to establish that love and that relationship with the Quran. It's very easy for us to now spend hours on YouTube and walk out being confused about the Quran. Because there's a lot of people who don't like Muslims, who don't like Islam, who want to see Muslims and Islam completely wiped away, eradicated, exterminated, erased from the face of this planet. And their entire purpose in life is to create and sow doubt in the hearts of Muslims. And if you spend enough time on YouTube, on social media, watching the videos of these so-called Islamic experts who are not even Muslim, you will walk away with a lot of doubt, with a lot of uncertainty, with a lot of confusion. They're confused and they make you confused. They're confused and they have absolutely no answer. They have absolutely no alternative. But the only thing that they have to offer you is their confusion, their misguidance, and their deviance. So dear brothers and sisters, one of the things that we need to really be careful of is where we get our information from. Seeking knowledge in Islam is a very, very lofty activity, a very lofty deed, a very noble and rewarding deed. But it's contingent upon the fact that you need to seek knowledge from the right sources, from the right people. People that you've never seen, that you can never interact with, that you've never met. You don't know what their qualifications are, you don't know what their credentials are. They just make nice videos. They may have an apparently cogent argument. Those are not the people you want to be taking your knowledge from, especially if you're not listening. And this is something that we've seen, we're noticing more and more. That there's a lot of young Muslims who are now confused, not because they've actually spent time researching and doing any formal study, but because they're spending too much time watching nonsense from people who have no idea what the Quran is, how the Quran was preserved, how the Quran was protected. They do some superficial, cursory reading on Wikipedia or whatever the case, or they listen to someone else, and then they just regurgitate all that. And then you listen to it and then you get confused. So the first way to protect your relationship with the Quran is to avoid confusion and misguidance and misinformation about the Quran itself. So be careful where you get your information about the Quran from. It should definitely not be people who don't have any sort of interest in the Quran, any sort of appreciation of the Quran. So that's number one, and that's an obvious point, but sometimes Shaitan will come to you and say, well, listen to this guy's YouTube channel, listen to this guy's argument, and listen to what he says, be open-minded. You have a brain, you can think of it, you can determine yourself what is right and wrong. And yeah, all that is true. But if you don't have a foundation, if you don't know right from wrong to begin with, then you're playing with fire. So it's obvious, and you shouldn't do that, but it goes without saying that sometimes we need to remind yourself even what's obvious and what's common sense. Now with that being said, dear brothers and sisters, we want to take some time going over the miraculous nature of the Quran. What makes the Quran so special? In the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala challenges the disbelievers, not once, not twice, but 3 times in the Quran. Allah says, وَإِن كُنْتُمْ فِي رَيْبٍ. And if you have any doubt whatsoever about the Quran, then فَأْتُوا بِسُورَةٍ مِّن مِّثْلِهِ. Then produce a surah, produce a chapter, produce something like the Quran. If you think the Quran is something that Rasulullah fabricated, if you think it's something that Rasulullah put together on his own, then the Prophet is a person just like you. The Prophet is a man just like you. The Prophet is someone who's living, has been living amongst you. What makes him so special? If he can produce something like the Quran, as you say, it's fabricated and forged, then why don't you bring forth, why don't you produce something equivalent to the Quran? That is the challenge of the Quran that Allah put forth, as we said 3 times throughout the Quran. And you have to understand that during the time of Rasulullah, this was at the eloquence, at the peak, the pinnacle, the height of Arabic poetry, of Arabic eloquence, of Arabic rhetoric. You have people that are able to just produce lines and lines of beautiful poetry on the spot. Just like how nowadays when you have musicians and rappers and whatnot, they can just produce lines of different raps and whatnot right in front of you. Like that, during the time of Rasulullah, you had these poets who could just produce poetry, lines of poetry. right there and then it would be the most beautiful poetry. So the Quran is challenging these people who denied the Quran by saying that if you reject the Quran, if you think that the Quran is not from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that the Quran is from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then produce something similar to it. That challenge was not accepted. No one from the disbelievers, no one from the Quraysh, no one from the most eloquent of poets were able to accept that challenge and actually defeat that challenge. All of them failed. And there were many poets who were sincere. After listening to the Quran, they accepted Islam. They said, we've never heard anything more beautiful, more eloquent than the Quran. That's one aspect why the Quran is so miraculous. The other aspect of the miraculous nature of the Quran are all the different prophecies that Allah has put in the Quran. And one of the most significant, prominent prophecies of the Quran is the Quran itself. As we said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, إِنَّا نَحْنُ نَزَّلْنَا الذِّكْرَ وَإِنَّا لَهُ لَحَافِظُونَ. That Allah takes responsibility of protecting and preserving the Quran. The same Quran that was revealed to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the same Quran that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam read, the same Quran that the Sahaba heard from the mouth of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the same Quran that we read today. This is a living prophecy, a living miracle of our deen. If there's no other miracle that you want to take into consideration, just this one, this is sufficient. That every Quran you pick up throughout the world, every person who's memorized the Quran, every Hafiz, the millions of Hufad who have memorized the Quran, they've memorized the same exact thing. They've recited, they've memorized the same exact thing as Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And it's been preserved, it's been protected. Allah makes the claim, Allah says He's going to protect it. 1400 years have passed, and Allah is continuing to protect it. If that is not a miracle of the Quran that cleans out and wards off any sort of doubt about the Quran, then I don't know what is. This is the most miraculous nature of the Quran itself. Now, from one of the things that sometimes non-Muslims will use to confuse Muslims, they say, there's different ways of reciting the Quran. And because there's different ways of reciting the Quran, that means the Quran has to be changed. Or they'll point out certain aspects of history where the manuscripts of the Quran were standardized. And they'll say these different things to confuse you. So inshallah, we're going to take a few minutes to just kind of talk about that so that you have a clear idea of how the Quran was preserved and it was protected during the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Even till now, the main transmission of the Quran has always been oral. It's been memorization. We listen to it, we memorize it, and we pass it on. In today's time, although majority of us, we read the Quran, but if someone were to take all the Qurans and burn them, destroy them, do you think the Quran would be gone? Of course not. We have millions of people who have memorized the Quran, who can write it from memory. You can burn all the books, but the Quran will still be in the hearts of millions of Muslims who can recite it back to you, who can read it back to you, who can write it back to you. And likewise, during the time of Rasulullah, this was the main way the Quran was preserved. Because back then, they didn't have printing presses. Back then, they didn't have nice pieces of paper and nice pens to write with. Or only a handful of people who actually knew how to read and write. So the main way of preserving the Quran was through the memorization of the Quran, the oral transmission of the Quran. Then during the time of al-Bukhari, it was the exact same thing. It was through the oral transmission of the Quran. But one of the things that Abu Bakr did, and the entire Ummah owes Abu Bakr for this great accomplishment, is that Abu Bakr, he compiled all the manuscripts, all the pieces of the Quran into one book. During the time of the Messenger of Allah Islam, when an ayah of the Quran would be revealed, Rasulullah, he had a number of people, scribes, who knew how to read and write. One of them being Zayd bin Thabit, who was one of the neighbors of Rasulullah. And the Messenger of Allah would command him that write this down. He would recite it, and Zayd bin Thabit would write it down. And likewise, there were many Sahaba who had pieces and portions of the Quran written down. So what Abu Bakr did was he took all the different pieces and portions of the Quran that were written down with other people, and he compiled it into one book. This is the one book that we have as a main source. But again, there were hundreds of people who had the Quran memorized. Not everyone could open that book and read. Not everyone knew how to read. During the time of Uthman, as the Muslim empire began to expand, what Uthman did, and this is one of the things that the Muslim Ummah owes a huge deal to Uthman for. He standardized the text of the Quran. He made the text of the Quran standardized. Because just like how in English, you have different dialects, you have different ways of spelling words, depending on where you're from. If you're from England, you're going to spell the word color differently than how you spell it here in America. You spell it with a U. Or you pronounce something different. Likewise, when the Quran was revealed to Rasulullah, it was revealed in Sada'atu Ahad. Rasulullah said, he asked Jibreel that if the Quran could be recited in different dialects, so that it could be easy for all the different tribes, Arab tribes, to recite. Because some ways of reciting the Quran is easier than others. Again, the actual text of the Quran remains the same. It's just the pronunciation or the dialect that changes in order to facilitate ease of recitation. Just like how you have British English or American English or Australian English, whatever the case, they're all English. It's just different dialects, sometimes different spelling. But it's still English at the end of the day. So likewise, the Quran was revealed in Sab'atu Ahruf, in 7 different, you can say, modes of recitation. And this was done to facilitate ease in reciting the Quran. So what Uthman did was, as the Muslim empire expanded, some Muslims began to get confused. Newer Muslims, they were saying, hey, why are you reciting the Quran like this? This is how I was taught. You're reading the Quran incorrectly. Just like how now, if someone had to start reading the Quran in a different variation that we're not familiar with, we may get confused. We say, hey, I've never heard the Quran being recited like that. So likewise, these new Muslims are being confused. If people can kind of move over, please. So what Uthman did was he standardized the text of the Quran in order to mitigate and remove this confusion from the Ummah of Muslims. Dear brothers and sisters, we'd like to end by reminding ourselves once more that if we want to protect our Iman, if we want to safeguard and preserve our Iman, it is done by safeguarding, protecting, and preserving our relationship with the Quran. And once we take the time to realize and appreciate the miraculous nature of the Quran, how the Quran was preserved and protected, and once we can appreciate that this same Quran that we recite today is the very same Quran that was revealed to Rasulullah, that Rasulullah recited from his mouth, and what the Sahaba heard through their ears, is the exact same thing that we have in front of us today. Once we can appreciate that, then inshallah, it'll be easier to navigate through the challenges and the trials and the difficulties and the tests of our Iman that we face in our modern day society today. بارك الله لنا ولكم في القرآن المجيد ونفعنا وإياكم بآيات الذكر الحكيم. استغفر الله لي ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروا إنه هو